Hello, I'm Mike Lambert, developer for I guess both the front end and the back end portions of Clowder, as well as some of the infrastructure concerns as well. So one of the things that we've been tasked with is creating some sort of UI for collecting parameters to send to extractors. Now, Clowder has a set of extractors that we have base ones that will give image previews, give video previews, like what Luigi was just showing off. And there's more complex ones, like the geotiff ones, like he was mentioning, will actually scrape metadata out and push it back to GeoServer and link up all this stuff with some neat metadata. Very complex stuff. One of the problems with that has been because they can vary so greatly, it's been a challenge to find one UI that kind of covers collecting all of these parameters all at once. So previous iterations of us trying to do this have been just have a text box next to, I guess I should have pointed out, sorry, on the right side is, this is the page that you would see if you were submitting a file for extraction. It lists off all the extractors with their names, a slight description, and like a little button to submit the file. Previously, slotted in kind of a text field here, a multi-line text field, allowed you to enter full JSON and JavaScript object notation to specify your parameters. It's a little tedious, very error prone, particularly for people who weren't familiar with that format. If you have a comma in the wrong place, suddenly the JSON is invalid, and it can be hard for people who aren't familiar with that to pick it up. So I've tried to leverage this this library that I ran into called JSON form, which instead of having our little multi-line text box, now we can have per extractor forms generated that kind of give you a little more guidance of what parameters to enter for that. So the way that it works is you provided a schema with the data that you're trying to collect. You basically just a list of property name and the type, and so you can give it sub-properties, stuff like I want this to be capitalized, I want this to have a different name, stuff like that visually. And then you give it a form, basically another little snippet of JSON saying this is what I want the presentation to be. So you give it a little bit about the data, you give it a little bit about the presentation, and it kind of looks like this. So here's an example of one of them. This was for the S3 Archival Extractor. Just takes a single parameter. The parameter is called operation. It's an enum with two values, archive or unarchived. You can see at the top is the schema part. So up here we've got the schema, and that just says we've got an operation. It's a string. We want it to be capitalized, the title and everything. And these are the default and the values that you can have for it. And then the lower section is the presentation part, which is given this property operation from up here, we want it to be a select, which is a drop-down box. We want it to not show the title, because otherwise it will say operation above it, which if you only have one parameter looks a little weird, but if you have multiple, that can be very helpful. And then we have also mapped the values of this to what we want them to look like on the screen. So it actually capitalizes them for us and everything, and generates that. And then when the user clicks submit, whatever the drop-down option has been chosen will get sent to the extractor, and the extractor can operate on those parameters appropriately. Another example, almost the same example, is the disk archival extractor. Just for fun, I decided to not do a drop-down for this one, just to show how flexible this framework can be. And there's a lot of it's the same exact schema up here, so we haven't changed that at all. The only difference is same key. We've got, instead of a select, we said radio buttons, and we said when we want it active, which means whatever one we've chosen, we'll apply this Bootstrap CSS class to it. So this is a little more slightly complex configuration, but sort of conveys how flexible this is, in that you can give it arbitrary CSS classes and kind of customize. If you wanted to customize further Clowder's CSS, you could, and put very complex behavior here. But button success is just one that comes built into Bootstrap, so it seemed like an easy choice here. And we have the same stuff about mapping the titles and everything. And there's some additional parameters here about what to select by default, because a select has an option chosen by default, it'll only have archive or unarchive. This button, when you come in, won't default. So we have to add some extra logic in there with this value to default it properly. And I realized that there's a couple lines here that say default, and they for this particular example didn't seem to work very well. So there was a little bit of extra-ness that was needed for that. There's a lot of different supported types, so I've only shown off a couple here, but there's a lot of stuff that they have. They collect like images and colors and dates and all the basics, with the booleans and strings and enums and all that. So it's, there's just a whole, there's stuff I haven't even thought of really. I don't mean to dive into the documentation very much here, but there's kind of just a lot of so many configuration options, like images and like arrays and tab arrays and all kinds of stuff. So there's kind of a lot there. And oops, I may have, well, I've done something.
There's the one.
It's gone, okay. Sorry. So there's a lot of different configuration options and stuff there to play around with. And there's actually, I sort of glossed over it because I didn't realize that this bar at the bottom was covering over it. But there's this other link in my slides is a playground where they actually give you a lot of like different demos and exactly what the schema should look like for them. So if we wanted like an image selector, this now lets us like select icons and stuff. Or if we wanted like to see, what's an example? Here's just like some basic radio buttons. Here's like an array with a bunch of stuff. So it's like a multi-level arrays if you wanted to collect this kind of information. So that's kind of, some very complex examples there. But I just kind of wanted to sort of outline that a little bit. And one aside is one of the things that they have in the documentation is submit as a type. So you can say, add your own submit button to the form. Please don't do this. There's already a submit button that's included with each of them. So there's no reason to yourself include the submit button explicitly. By default, they will generate a form that has all of the keys that you specify, including a submit button. But if you specify your own form, please don't include that because it won't work the way that you expect it to, unless you add additional logic into there. But that case hasn't been tested yet. So this is a very early feature, and we're still kind of playing around to see how it works and everything. So if anybody has curious use cases or anything for this one, or if they run into problems using it, or if you just need more information about it, feel free to drop us a line on the Slack or send an email, or happy to answer questions about this one. So,
Questions? I have one. I think one thing that maybe you can say a little bit about it is now you click the Clowder submit button and this JSON document gets to the extractor, right? And then it's really up to the extractor. I guess it's more common. It's really just up to the extractor to know what to do with that.
Yeah, there's so Luigi probably knows this intimately, but for folks who haven't dealt with the extractors very much, the way that they're sort of laid out is there's a process message method that just gets executed when your extractor gets called. So it's like, whether it's a manual submission or on-file upload, this process message method gets called, and one of the parameters to it is the parameters that you send through this UI. So you can actually just access them right there from the Python, from PyClowder. It should be fairly intuitive to, like, once you're in the code and you get past these parameters, like what exactly do you want to do with them? It's completely up to you, completely up to the extractor.
And the other thing that I don't know, maybe you did mention, but I don't know if it was clear to everyone, was that the JSON you were showing, it's actually JSON that you provide in the extractor info, right? The JSON.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that as well. Every extractor I believe every extractor that's based on PyClowder, do all of them, all of the extractors, have an extractor info.json next to them that uses the same format as JSON form happens to use. So one of the fields in that extractor info that I've added is called parameters. and the parameters that you would be adding are the same as I can show, sorry, it's a little bit. So the playground thing that we were, like this whole object is exactly what you pass in for the parameters. So I need, if you like, here's the schema and here's the form that I was talking about before, those are the exact same fields as you need to provide to the extractor info. And the extractor info.json, when the extractor starts, gets submitted over to Clowder, and then these parameters and the schema gets stored into Clowder. So then Clowder knows how to present it to the user when they're submitting. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, so as a developer of an extractor, now you can add this information to your extractor info, and then whenever somebody tries to manually submit a data set or a file to the extractor, they will automatically see that UI, and that's how they will. So,
one question I just had, do we know if we're tracking the parameters that one submits to an extractor in the extraction history? If I can look at when an extractor was run, can I see what parameters were used to run it?
That's an excellent question. I don't think we
did, but
no, they're in the RabbitMQ message, and I don't think the whole message gets cached right now.
okay.
And
We
then
might want
after
to think
that,
about if you want to
yeah.
store that in Clowder.
Yeah, that's a great point.
One question about the actual data that gets sent. So, does the extractor also need to know the content in the form field, or it just needs a key value pairs?
Oh, I don't know if I have an example here of how it gets sent, but I might be able to if I open the debugging console and do some weird stuff, I might be able to find it. But so the way that it works is you give it this schema, the user then enters, hello world over here, and there's a JavaScript method then to get the value of the form, and when I get the value of the form, it just comes back as JSON. It's just a key value of like, oh, you had a field, it was called a field, its value was hello world, and then so it just sends it as a JSON object, like a key value pair kind of thing, like you were saying. But the UI helps translate like complex user input down into those key value pairs.
And on the extractor side, we put the whole thing what is there on the left, and that is what is used to render the actual form on the Clowder UI, right?
Yeah, the top part that you talked about on the left here.
Left side.
Yeah. So the schema here just describes what data you're collecting, and then this form part is the presentation part. So in this case, they're saying, I want a field that's this field, and then they explicitly put their submit button.
I would add, basically, there is no JavaScript or code that you have to add to Clowder, right?
Right, and that's something else that I kind of glossed over that probably I should have outlined a little bit more, is that this is pretty powerful because you can, as an extractor developer, you can now influence the UI that is used to submit to your extractor without knowing anything about JavaScript, aside from, I guess, a little bit of JSON, which is fairly analogous to the Python object notation stuff. So it's
Also think about, for people who might be triggering extractors like this via the API, is there an easy way that I can request in the extractor info or elsewhere all the parameters that I have available to me that I might want to include? I don't know if that's an extractor info right now.
Yeah, it is currently. It's in extractor info.json, and then when you register the extractor, it gets pushed up into Mongo with the extractor info stuff. So it should be in there with all the same with like the MIME types that the extractor operates on, and all the description of who maintains it and all that. So it should be preserved in there.
Sorry for something.
No worries. I've been kind of I missed some things initially, and so thankfully Luigi pointed out for me to go back and kind of clarify a little bit.
Now that the extractor can modify the UI on this page, how does it work with like data validation? So, for example, bad characters and things like that. Does the JSON form takes care of that?
I don't know that it explicitly. I mean, it might depend on what you're trying to collect. So I don't think that it's going to do any like trimming of strings or like any. It's not going to know that you're trying to collect a URL, so you need a regex for a URL to validate that. Like, I think the validation part is going to happen a lot on the extractor side, at least initially. There may be hooks for that in here that I haven't learned about yet, because like I said, this is kind of a complicated framework. So there's a lot of like weird little examples. I think they do have validation examples. I just haven't delved into exactly because like there's so many different ways that you can configure and things that you can collect with this that like it's hard to nail down something that like even with something as simple as validation, like how do you validate that input?
I understand. I was just wondering like if that's something to look into.
Yeah, and so some of it can be kind of lent to like if you could collect that operation parameter that I showed as a string, but then the user can enter things that aren't archived or unarchived. So you can kind of use the data type, the schema type, to limit what kind of data they can enter there, if possible. If it needs to be an arbitrary string and you need to operate on that, then there may be like different levels of validation that need to happen there. But some of them can be helped by picking the appropriate schema, and some of them can't. So.
But I think in the end, the extractor is going to have to do something, especially if there's multiple fields that you ask for. Because I can type in 2 values that are totally validatable, but make no sense if I look at the same time. So the extractor is going to have to do something. And at that point, you need to make sure that you give the right feedback to the user through the extractor message saying, hey, this is an error, and this is the error, why?
A checkbox for verbose and a checkbox for silent.
Yeah.
And it's like, what do I do now?